Thank you for joining us this afternoon. Um, my name is Jeremy Pope, and I'm an evaluator in Kentucky. I work at the University of Kentucky. This is my 12th year working with SPDGs, evaluating Kentucky and Tennessee. This is my coworker, Eileen Grady. I'll let her introduce herself.
Hello, it's nice to meet you all. I also work at UK with Jeremy. Um, and I've been at the evaluation unit for about 3 years, but this is really my first SPDIG that I'm really working on. So I've kind of got started with it from the beginning. So I'm still learning a lot from Jeremy.
A little extra context. This is Kentucky's second year. So we just finished the first year, but as many of you will know, finish first year means we kind of have some contracts in place. So really, this is the meat of the real work. The focus of our SPDIG is on transition for high school students with disabilities. And it's in three tiers. The first tier is primarily focused on asynchronous learning modules. The second tier will build on those learnings and create small cohorts for intensive coaching and communities of practice to further dig into the tier one learning and to help implementation. And then tier three will continue that work into district teams and focus on district action plans and also dig into certain topics that are more, the teachers will pick certain topics that they want to really, really hone in on, and then there'll be a coach and a trainer hired to do that. Um, and so that's the model that's hopefully going to end up in place. It's been moving well, but as many of you know, things are gone slower than we would have expected, but we're still proud of what we've been able to do. One of the big pieces of that work is setting up a competency assessment. And so that's why we decided to talk about this last October. Not the fun. Share screen. All right. And hopefully you guys can see my screen. So we have used different surveys pre-post before, but we first started using what we called a competency assessment a few years ago with one of our grant projects in Kentucky that was focused on training and developing the future directors of special education. So the state got a special grant to work with pre-directors towards their certification. And a competency assessment for us is essentially a self-reported survey that really digs into what are the essential knowledge and skills that someone exhibits who's really excellent and awesome. And so, really, who are those stars that we would like more people to be like? Often in SPDIGs, we kind of come either at that end or we have this group of teachers who are really struggling and how do we help make them better? And then the SPDIG really focuses on what we will do. And so that's why I kind of picked this picture is that, the SPDIG ends up kind of being this weird machine that where hopefully we turn, you know, turn a group of teachers into stars. Now, my experience with SPDIGs in my states is often what happens is we get really focused when we write the application on what a star looks like. But then by the time we get to the second and third year, we're so used to our system and our machine, for lack of a better term, that sometimes that's all we measure, that's all we talk about, and we start to forget the big picture again of what it was we really wanted everyone to be able to do and what we wanted them to really be able to do for kids. And so the competency assessment really helps us stay focused on that. It helps also give us a really nice 5 year difference. So we can measure what people feel they can do at an intense level and then check again at the end. And it gives us really interesting evaluation feedback. The key for making this be as best as it can is really focusing on what these prompts will be. And we're still learning. We're not experts yet, but we've been refining those processes over the last couple of years. And that's really what we're going to primarily focus on today is hopefully give you some pointers to help you do better at this than we did in the first couple practices of it. Some recommendations we'll give you for the basics is that it's really important to look at the exemplar roles. Like, what are these people doing? Because when we're not careful, especially with SPDGs, we're trying to teach usually administrators and teachers. And a lot of these skills and knowledge things that the teachers need are very different than what the principals need. But we sometimes will end up with one competency checklist. So we're trying to be really focused on what are those roles and responsibilities, and even sometimes having to create two competency checklists instead of one so that we hopefully get better information. We have to look at what level of knowledge is really needed to perform each of these roles. Often we want to ask a lot of other knowledge questions that are interesting to us, but we're trying to learn how to be more and more focused on what really are the most essential things that are going to make those classroom practices change. And then we're doing the same thing with skills. What are those essential skills that are needed? Not everything we're going to train, but what are the key things? And that's what we try to focus our prompts on. This is an example of that director of special education. Obviously, I know it's not really meant to be read, but I did want to show you that what it can give us at the end, being able to compare and see kind of how much people say they grew after this program was 2 years on these key competencies, and how this really helps us then share this with stakeholders and other leaders in the state. And it's been an excellent way for us to show the value of the program from the viewpoint of the participants. So we had one that was for knowledge. We also did one for skill. We also used a competency checklist for one of our projects in the state working with early childhood teacher leaders. One of the things we learned from this process as we went along was that why it's really important to write prompts that really challenge people. On this particular competency checklist, there was an attitude at the beginning that, because we were coming right out of COVID, that if we asked things in a way that were too difficult, we would discourage teachers. And we were recruiting teachers who were already exemplar teachers. And so the leadership of that project was a little worried about pushing some of the skill and knowledge to its hardest level in the prompt. So what that did is it kind of muted some of our learning and some of our growth. So while the growth was still very strong on many of these items, that was one of the feedback things we got when we unpacked this with the leadership team, is they wished they had been more bold and had asked prompts that asked for higher levels of Bloom's taxonomy, because then they think that the teachers would have rated themselves slightly lower at the beginning, but still rated themselves very high at the end, and it would have shown a better representation of the true growth that we believe we experienced and that teachers gave us in their qualitative feedback. I'm now going to turn it over to Eileen. She's going to talk more about the experience of creating the competency checklist for Kentucky's new SPDG.
Thanks, Jeremy. Yeah, so now I'll just walk you through. So kind of taking all of Jeremy's experience and knowledge, I kind of came at this to create a competency assessment for our current SPDG. So I'll just kind of talk through that process. And he kind of already went over how there's going to be the three tiers of learning. And so the overall idea for this competency assessment is we wanted to be able to measure growth throughout all three of our tiers. So we're going to have them take it before they do anything for baseline and then again at the end of each tier. So that's another reason we really don't want them to have very high ratings at baseline, because we want them to have a lot of room for growth throughout all three of the tiers. And kind of how I started trying to come up with my items. We have a curriculum map for tier one. And so I kind of just started with that to give me something to work with. And on that curriculum map, there's 26 modules in tier one. And so I ended up my first round that I had 26 items, one for each module. And that was too many items. And it was also too directly tied just to that tier one knowledge. And so we also wanted to kind of take into account that tier two and tier three. So then I worked with the project directors to kind of start thinking about what really were big skills they wanted participants to gain by the end of tier three. So what do they really want these people to be able to do coming out of the whole program? And because that tier one is those asynchronous virtual modules, that's a lot more knowledge based. And so we don't really anticipate the major growth in skills until those later tiers. And so we condensed the items down to 15 from that original 26. And so we were really trying to just focus on the big picture of those skills that we want participants to leave the program with. And an example of that is we have a unit on comprehensive transition planning that originally I had 6 items to match the 6 modules in that unit. But tier one goes into a lot of details on all the aspects that make up comprehensive transition planning. But ultimately, we really just want participants to be able to conduct a comprehensive transition planning process that does include all those aspects, but we don't really need to measure individual items on all those different aspects. The end goal, we want them to be able to do that whole process. So again, just kind of thinking about that big picture. And Jeremy kind of already mentioned that Bloom's taxonomy. So after I kind of got those big items down with the project directors, I went back to the Bloom's taxonomy and tried to kind of refine those items to make sure that we were using the highest order of thinking to reframe those items. And again, because we want to reduce our baseline scores because we really want to give people room to grow. And then another thing that I was careful about and kind of had some questions about some of my items was double-barreled items, which you want to avoid having an item that asks for 2 different skills. So you really just you want it to be measuring one thing. And so an example, that first one up there, that if you can read it, I can develop individualized transition sections and IEPs that consider a student's specific interests, skills, and goals to support the student attaining positive post-school outcomes. And I had a couple items that I discussed with Jeremy. I was a little bit worried that they might be double-barreled because this one considers a student's specific interests, skills, and goals. I had a question, well, is that looking at 3 different things? But we determined it's really not. So the main thing we're asking is if they can develop individualized transition sections and IEPs. So I went through and underlined and bolded kind of the main thing that each item was asking for. And so the extra is kind of just providing context on what makes up that skill that we're asking for. But ultimately, we're really just asking for that main skill there. And after got kind of a working draft, we did some testing on it. So we have a colleague who works as a high school principal, and we had him test it as himself. So not just testing the survey to make sure it worked, but actually going through the items and rating them for himself, to kind of get a sense of how long it would take and if the items were clear or if they were confusing. And I also gave him a list of the items that were not underlined and bolded and asked him to underline what the main thing that he thought the item was asking for, just to see if ours matched, to see if he was interpreting it the way that I had written it. And luckily they did kind of match up, but if they're not matching up, you might want to go back and kind of rethink how they're written to make sure that your message is clear in the item. And so we haven't actually given this out yet, but we're hoping we're going to get some good data from it. But that's just kind of the process of how I work through that.
Here are some other recommendations. I know we mentioned a few of them, but think big. You want to really to leave yourself lots of openness for growth over usually multiple years for your participants, depending on how your program's built. And so you, again, don't focus too much on year one. Try to think much more beyond it. But then also remember that to stay within your SPDG, because you'll have some people in the team who will want to ask very interesting questions, but when you really dig into it, you're like, yeah, we don't think we can influence that. It'll be more luck than what we can really make happen. Make your ratings as specific as possible. Um, we also tried to look at this as, could it still meet the rigor of an in-person implementation check? Is this prompt clear enough that someone could go in the classroom or watch someone's practice and that prompt would still work as an observational prompt? And that helped us kind of work on our prompts and make them clearer and make them more meaningful. Make it personal for the taker. So lots of I can statements, so that it helps them really focus on their skill and knowledge and not think about colleagues or their school. Um, Eileen already shared about bolding and underlining and getting that checked, thinking about double barrel. Um, the other thing that we would recommend is being very careful with what your Likert prompts are. Um, I had one of these once that the prompts itself were kind of on adequacy, and essentially the prompt said inadequate. So as you can guess, no one picked that because even if they felt like they maybe were lower on the skill, no one wants to admit on a piece of paper that they're inadequate. Or so please, so think of that when you're creating these, like would any of these prompts accidentally make someone feel embarrassed because of the way it's worded? Um, Thinking also, I mean, I know we've seen the same thing happen with testing, right? When, you know, uh, where kids get labeled. And so try to reduce your labels that a teacher is probably not going to want to click. We still have, we were supposed to present for 15 minutes, which we just hit. And then we're supposed to give the room to you guys to ask questions, to refine some things that we presented. Or we can also talk about things in your state or how this may apply or just groupthink.
I have a question. Earlier, when you were talking about tiers, you mean you have three levels of training and coaching for the teacher, not the three tiers like in MTSS, correct?
Yes, we are using the
Okay.
word differently. Um,
Okay.
it's kind of just the original idea was thinking of it kind of like MTSS, where that we're doing levels of support. So our tier one is our universal, tier two is our moderate, and then tier three is again the smallest group. So the hope is that if I'm just going to make up some numbers, that if we have 1,000 do tier one, hopefully we can get 500 to do tier two, and we would do 250 would get tier three. A lot of that is also just based off of trying to do how we can do resources. I think if we had the money and the people power to do 1,000 through all three, that's what they would want to do. But they just didn't, they knew they didn't have the money to set all three of those up in 5 years.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have any of you used something like this before or maybe taken it as a member of another project?
We have something, a totally different topic, but where they do kind of a reflection. They're not necessarily rating themselves as more of an open-ended about what they can do. It's a much smaller group size, I'm sure, than what you guys have. But this is really interesting to me. Have you done any kind of alignments? Because we find when we use lots of different instruments, people that have core skills kind of overestimate what they can do. I think it's the Dunning-Kruger effect. Have you looked at any of that with your, or do you kind of parallel do a second check to look at can they really do those things or do they just think they can? We also have people underreport as well or underestimate themselves as well.
For our first two projects in the state, there was a limit to the ability to do any fidelity checks. So it wasn't required by the funding sources and there wasn't really the resources to do it. So this will be our first opportunity to really kind of cross-validate. And so our fidelity checks are going to be built into tier two and tier three. So it'll still be slightly limited, but it'll give us for the first time an ability to kind of The tier one group will take it at baseline, hopefully in the next couple of weeks as this first cohort's getting signed on. Then they'll take it again next fall before they start tier two. And then
Mm.
hopefully that's going to be linked up to the baseline of the fidelity measure. And then we'll have, after that year, be able to measure. So we're hoping that we can kind of do cross check it that way that you mentioned, because we know that that will help us refine and do better next time.
That's nice because there's been some data in like PBIS that shows that the self ratings are just as accurate as the external ratings. I like the care that you guys took in writing your prompts. I don't know that we were that methodical. That was nice to hear.
We got lucky this time that as the tier one was being built, it gave us more time than usual, and that the state did a really good job of setting up that curriculum committee. They always try to set up that external group, but this one particularly has been successful. They've got a really good balance of voices in the room, balance of expertise. And so that gave Eileen a really good starting spot. Um, for our for the director of special ed thing, it was kind of inventing it out of thin air, so it was much more difficult. Um, and so we've been very lucky this time.
We had our team at KDE also was really willing to kind of sit down with me and work through these and really kind of get into the weeds on some stuff. So that was also really helpful.
And to your earlier point, I don't know that we're ever going to come up with the magic bullet for writing prompts where people that there isn't a group of people who overrate themselves and a group of people who underrate. We're just trying our best to refine them to minimize it as much as we can. But we also, I know that self-report isn't as rigorous as being able to do observations, but the cost of doing observations is very prohibitive. But
Well,
especially,
and the observation is only as good as the tool and the person observing as well. So, you have similar, just my opinion.
but we've also found there's a lot of power in self-report, especially for something like a state education agency. Being able to say that this group of teachers feel more confident, that this group of teachers feels more prepared and ready, especially with some of the more advanced prompts that are asking for skill level, like going beyond regular knowledge and being able to teach other teachers or to be able to coach other teachers. And we have found that those statements have been super powerful when we give that data, that's the kind of data that they're being able to use to try to work on sustainability plans. Um, and to be honest, I think that for most of the leaders in our state, they care more what teachers say than just if I gave them observation data. I say experts say, and they'll care. But if I say teachers say they love this is what they want, it always goes better.
So just to clarify, so they were taking these surveys 1 year apart? That's the plan, like it's a whole year?
For both of those original programs, it did work out that way, that they took it
Okay.
multiple times each year.
Oh,
Part of,
multiple times in a year. Okay.
no, I'm sorry. They took it multiple times, which happened to be on an annual basis because
Okay.
because they were multi-year projects, and that's our plan for SPDG also is to do it once a year, but for
Okay.
multiple times. Part of that is so that we, instead of just taking it at the beginning and the end, the other reason we take it at the middle is because if we're seeing we have certain items that we expect to grow the most because of the tier one modules. So if we notice that they're not saying that their ratings are going up on those selected things, that the team really needs to go back into that curriculum and make revisions this summer before the second cohort comes on board. And so that's another way that this competency check hopefully will help us.
And how, I just like the numbers here. How many people, how many teachers are you evaluating with this? What's your sample size? And my part B to that would be, could you get just a smaller sampling of those teachers that you do direct observation with to see if your stuff matches up rather than try and observe every single one of them to see if they're really telling the truth.
Right. Yes, we think we could. We're part of the issue with this one in particular that's going to make it harder for us is that this tier one is focused uh, on setting up transition, but it's coming from both angles of special education and general ed. So half of the cohort will be CTE teachers with very little special education knowledge, and the other half will be special ed teachers who really know special ed transition, but know very little about CTE and gen ed. And so we considered doing something like that with the sample, but then we were having a really hard time coming up with what in the world our observation, how exactly we would measure this, because some of the concepts are not necessarily observable in a classroom. They take lots of steps, lots of things. So I really like your idea, and we did start that conversation, but we kind of ended it because we just didn't feel like we had the time to really figure it out.
Yeah, I totally get that. I used to be a CTE teacher and a special ed teacher, so yeah, I understand that gap there. So how many teachers overall are you sampling ish?
So the hope originally was that tier one would start in August. But because of delays in contracts and things that are normal, those things got delayed. And then there also were some technology issues where it took what we thought would take a month for approval took 5 months from the technology group to make sure that things were being built in the right platform. So we got delayed. Everything should be going online in the next few weeks with the first group of teachers. Because of that delay and some unspent funds, I think that the target for this first group is going to be 200 teachers
Oh,
with the
wow,
hope of
that's great.
increasing it each year, possibly even adding a cohort in between. It'll just depend on how much stipend money. As we save money other places, we have more stipend money, which means we can have more people.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's a great group to study. That's great.
I know we only have a few more minutes, but I know Eileen wanted to ask a second question of the group for something we're trying to tackle with this. And hopefully you guys can give us some advice.
Yeah, thanks, Jeremy. So, kind of building this out, I think Jeremy kind of mentioned it earlier, is that, administrators might need different skills than teachers. And especially for this tier one, it's open to all educators. So it's going to be administrators, general ed, special ed, CTE teachers, paraprofessionals, counselors. And that was something that came up in the curriculum committee also, is that learning objectives, like they thought that everybody needed to know them, but some roles might need to know them at a different depth than other ones. They might need to at least know about it to direct somebody to the right person. And so we kind of toyed with the idea of making a bunch of different competency assessments for all the different roles. But with all the different roles, it seemed like that was going to get too messy. So we're kind of trying to think of maybe ways to, when we analyze the data, maybe weight it differently based on somebody's role. But another problem is that we have people from all different districts, people from large districts and people from smaller districts. And somebody with the same role might do very different things depending on what district they're in. Um, and so that's something that we've kind of been discussing and struggling with. And we just wanted to pose that question and see if you all had any ideas or any thoughts on that.
Well, this is Leslie in New York State. And to me, that just sounds like adding covariates to your analysis, to control for rural versus urban settings and job. What's their job role? Are they administrator working at the district level or school or whatever it may be? Whatever you think is going to be important if you don't really have if literature doesn't tell you, oh, you need to control for these things, because you will find differences. Yeah. Yeah. And I think, yeah, for the single training to everybody, that's always challenging. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's, even thinking about the roles, that's just thinking about the people that are in the same roles but having those different responsibilities. Um, and so I like what you said about kind of controlling for maybe the size of the district because that could give just a little bit more um, specifics to that role.
Yeah, we've seen in our New York State SPDG just rural versus more urban settings, the project just looks very different.
So when you report then, I guess this is my question for everybody. When you report then, do you disaggregate that data and report on it like that? Or do you just report on it all together? Is pulling this stuff out something that you feel like you need to report for the SPDG for the national evaluators or just for your own knowledge?
When it comes to leaders versus teachers, we often try to disaggregate that and to present it differently, depending on what we're trying to answer. But no.
Now going to be titled 16 Things to Make Those EBPD Blues Go Away. So with that, we're just now at 5 to the top of the hour. So I'll reopen the rooms and you all can reselect which rooms you want to go into. And we will come back at West Coast time, 1:25. We'll see you all shortly.
Where do we select?
It should be available to select now.